Hey guys, I hope you had a great weekend. There's one topic that I still need to cover, but we're behind, so I just want to make this quick video about it. It's basically the physiology of a neuron. We've spent a lot of time on the anatomy of it. We talked about a little bit of the physiology as far as the impulse travel and the direction of that, but um, there's some craziness we need to talk about that no one really likes. It involves the sodium potassium pump and all that fun stuff. Excuse me. So as I talk through these slides, I want you to write down these notes in your notebook. Title it Neuron Physiology. Okay, so the first term we need to talk about is polarization. You probably know what this is from your biology or chemistry classes, but polarization essentially means whenever something is at rest or inactive, just like this says. So it's at rest. Right now, the neuron is in its resting state. Nothing's been triggered. Nothing's really happening. And for a neuron to be polarized, there are going to be fewer positive ions inside than outside the cell. So if you look here at the diagram, compared to the outside of the cell, we don't have very many positive ions inside of the cell. So yes, sodium and potassium are positive, but if you look at the amount, this is very different. So we have lots of sodium and some potassium outside the cell, and very few potassium ions inside of the cell. So that makes this more negative than the outside. So that's what polarization means. So take some time to copy this down. You might want to draw a little picture as well to understand. Logan, back off. Okay, depolarization. So this is whenever something, an electrical impulse, has been initiated or triggered. So that's depolarization. So it's kind of like the start of the action potential, which we've talked about with the muscles. And what happens is these sodium ions that were outside of the cell, all these sodium ions, whenever it was polarized or at rest, are going to rush inside of the cell and make the inside more positive. So we go from having more positive ions outside of the cell to more positive more positive ions inside of the cell. So it basically just flip-flops or switches. Okay, and when that happens, when those sodium ions go from outside to the inside, that's what creates the action potential that we talked about with the muscles. And it's the exact same process as the nerves. Nothing's changed, okay? And that's what creates that electrical impulse or action potential to take place. So write this slide down too. So polarization, more positive ions outside than inside. Depolarization, more positive ions inside than outside. So sodium's going to rush in. That's the first step. The next term you need to know is repolarization. That's when everything is going to, as it says, repolarize. It's going to go back to its resting state. So this happens after the cell is done with the action potential, trying to get back to rest. So what happens is, you guessed it, the sodium ions are going to go from being inside of the cell to outside of the cell again, okay? So it's going back to a polarized state. And like it says here, a neuron must be repolarized in order to conduct another impulse. So in order for this whole process to happen again, a cell has to be repolarized. So sodium is going to go from inside to outside. And this happens with the sodium-potassium pump. So write this slide down as well. So sodium-potassium pump, that is what's used. It's used for a lot of different things, but muscle contraction and nerve impulses, it is used to pump sodium, potassium in and out for an action potential to take place or to reverse it or put a cell back to normal, okay? So it's going to pump excess sodium out and pump potassium ions into the cell to stabilize the cell once again. So this is going to sound hauntingly familiar because we talked about this a little bit with the muscles and acetylcholine and whenever we talked about muscle contraction. So this is the flow of events in general. Sorry, my dog is biting the mess out of my fingers. So impulse neuron to neuron. So impulse reaches the axon terminal. So we learned that with muscles. So in order for a muscle to contract, the impulse has to first reach the axon terminals, the action potential. But I want you to think, if the muscles, we learned what the action potential was, okay? We learned that's what it was. But here is the actual mechanics behind it. So what takes place before all that is the exchange of sodium potassium. Okay, so first is impulse reaches axon terminals. Number 2, calcium is going to enter the axon terminals, and that's going to trigger those neurotransmitters to be released. So with muscle contraction, we learned that neurotransmitter was acetylcholine. Okay, remember I talked about how sodium can't get into the cell without its pal acetylcholine that binds to the synapse or to the membrane. This is the same thing here. So impulse, calcium enters the axon terminals, and calcium triggers neurotransmitters to be released into the synapse, okay? So this is not new. So here are a few neurotransmitters. You don't have to write this down. These are just a few popular ones. Dopamine makes you feel good. Serotonin makes you sleepy and calm. Nicotinic ACH makes muscle contraction happen. Things like that. So you don't have to know all these. These are just some examples of how many options we have here that our body secretes. But no matter which one's secreted, calcium is going to trigger neurotransmitters to be released. The fourth thing that happens is the neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic membrane and binds to the receptor on the membrane. So with muscle contraction, we learned that acetylcholine was the neurotransmitter that bound to the synaptic cleft, okay? And so polarized membrane becomes depolarized, triggering an action potential. And that's where that sodium comes in at. So remember I said that acetylcholine causes sodium to enter, and that's what causes the action potential to take place. It becomes depolarized at that time. All right, so impulse is regenerated at the dendrites and travels through the axon. So basically what it's saying is that impulse is going to travel through the whole entire axon. And as it does so, it's going to bounce along. Okay, this is just a fancy word for bouncing along the myelin sheath. Remember, myelination helps the impulse travel very, very quickly. And unmyelinated neurons, it's going to run very, very slowly. Okay? So that's basically it. And then after that, the whole cell, the whole neuron is going to repolarize and it's going to return to its resting state. And remember, sodium is going to flood from the inside of the cell to the outside to return to its initial positivity on the outside and more negativity on the inside. Okay? And that is pretty much it. All right. We will see your lovely souls tomorrow.